Hello, and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Our topic this time is a unique learning technique called Suggestopedia. Our guest is Jerome Lafferty, who's been using it for many years to teach foreign languages. Jerome, what is Suggestopedia? How does it work?
How does it work? Suggestopedia began in 1965 with funding by the Russians in parapsychology. And they were very interested in developing a way of creating a state of what they call hyperamnesia, the ability to remember vast amounts of material. And they farmed this project out to Bulgaria, to the work of a Dr. Georgy Lozanov. Dr. Lozanov is a medical doctor. He's also a psychotherapist. And in his work as a psychotherapist, he has encountered areas of hyperamnesia. Bulgaria is a very strange country. It has a lot of yogis in Bulgaria, which is something not many people know. And they have been able to use a lot of their relaxation techniques to produce not only states of hyperamnesia, but also states of hypercreativity. Some of the early work Dr. Lozanov was interested in was investigating the work done by religious groups in India, where they would memorize their whole religious library. In case of fire or destruction of the work, that way it would be maintained by the memorizers. The memorizers were selected arbitrarily, not because of their ability to learn. And this really raised interesting questions with Dr. Lozanov. If this ability to remember this vast amount of material can be assigned arbitrarily, then hyperamnesia is a capacity that we all have, and it only takes a bit of education and training to develop it. Well, the early work in Suggestopedia was the application of suggestion, much like in hypnosis, to learning, but without the hypnotic trance. The early work began as memory experiments, memorizing lists of words. From there, the question became evident. Well, it's easy to memorize words. How can we put it to use? And so they decided, well, words are part of languages. Why don't we try to teach with the Suggestopedic technique, a foreign language? And since 1968, that's been the work that's been going on in Bulgaria. Essentially, what is done in Suggestopedia is that we accelerate the learning process by over 400%. In other words, we will teach in 1 hour what would take our State Department or our Defense Department in Monterey 5 hours to teach. We will teach in 1 month what it would take them 5 months to do. We'll teach the foreign language in 80 hours instead of 400 hours.
And you suggest that it works for everybody? It has universal application?
It does have universal application. This is one of the interesting principles of Suggestopedia, that there exists in everyone this vast ability, these reserve capacities that aren't normally tapped into in our regular educational process. So the whole structure of Suggestopedia is to stimulate the individual in order to tap into these reserves. And they're very specific what these reserves are, what sections of the brain are affected by it, how a teacher, for instance, would direct the stimuli so that it will always be positive, filter out negative stimuli in the classroom. It's a very environmental teaching approach. Not only a physical environment, our classrooms are very comfortable and very light and suggestively very pleasant, but it's also a psychological environment that we're trying very hard to create, and a sociological environment as far as the interaction among the students, so that at all times the teacher is really an orchestrator of stimuli, directing certain stimuli while filtering out others so as to produce this maximum effect.
Excuse my ignorance, but amnesia to me has always been what people who wander around and can't remember what their name is. And yet you're suggesting hyperamnesia as being something obviously very different, in fact opposite.
It would be the opposite. It would be the ability to remember vast amounts of material. Also, some of the work that's coming out of the Eastern European countries at present indicate that this type of teaching produces hypercreativity, the ability to compose music, the ability to perform in the arts, to a greater degree than, or a more accelerated degree than otherwise.
You create an atmosphere that is conducive to this special kind of learning, and you have obviously some teaching techniques that are very basic to it. You talked about the social setting, so that there's a particular type of interaction that goes on among the students. But why does it work? Can you give us a scientific explanation of what's happening electrochemically or psychographically or any other way?
Okay, well, I guess the best way to explain that is that when children learn languages, they reach their optimum point of learning between the ages of 4 and 7 years of age. Well, in hypnosis, you can regress people back into that time so that they remember exactly what went on at their birthday party when they were 5 years old, who was present, what type of ice cream they had. We don't do age regression. What we do, however, is a term called infantilization. We use this in the classroom. We're trying to stimulate the subcortical structures of the brain by use of games and by use of songs and by use of intonation of the teacher, a constant coaxing in the intonation patterns. In other words, activating certain areas of the brain that haven't been used since childhood so as to stimulate that type of learning that went on at that time. Simultaneously with that, however, we are also treating the adult as an adult, presenting logical explanations and grammar. If you want to use the terms of right hemisphere and left hemisphere, we don't use them because they're somewhat inadequate and they're not very specific. But if you do use those terms, then what we are doing is trying to unite both hemispheres, both capacities, together with the cortical and the subcortical structures of the brain, the logical abilities, together with some of the intuitive, affective abilities.
Does this suggest possibly that it may hold a clue for why some teachers are more effective than other teachers outside of these specific techniques? You talk about intonation and the attitude and the, what did you call it, infantility?
Infantilization.
Infantilization. Is it possible that subconsciously public school teachers around the country, some of them do this already or are approaching some of the methods that you're suggesting?
Well, I think this goes on, and Dr. Lozano points this out, in all communication, not only in terms of teaching, but in all communication. There are two planes going on simultaneously. What a person is actually saying, the content, is one plane of communication, but simultaneously with that, you do have all of the other elements of the conversation that are coming out, the setting, how the person is dressed, his attitude, the tone of voice, whether he is excited about his work or whether it's just something that he's not attaching importance to. And certainly if the teacher doesn't attach importance to it in all of these peripheral manner, then this is a message which is coming out as well. I think an effective teacher is one who tries to create a harmony between both the direct plane of what is being spoken and also all of the emotive and the peripheral that go on in any environment, psychological environment.
The medium is the message.
The medium is very much the message. It's very much part of it in any event.
You talked. You touched briefly on the classroom situation. Could you describe for us the classroom setting and how specifically it might be different than what we would think of as a traditional classroom?
Again, I'd have to talk about it in terms of the physical environment, but also in terms of the psychological environment, in terms of the sociological environment. The physical environment is a very pleasant environment. When you walk into the classroom, there will be pictures on the wall. If we're teaching Spanish or French, there will be posters, pictures, artwork of some of the great artists of the different countries. Well, these are definitely physical environmental factors. However, they're placed at a periphery of vision so that the student never really directs his attention to this. However, this is also part of the message which is coming about. If at any given time in the class the student feels a bit tired, he always knows that there's this beautiful piece of art hanging on the wall, talking to him, encouraging him that he's over there and that he's part of this. I think more important is the relaxed state of attention that goes on in the class. And this is really the psychological environment that we try to establish in our teaching. An example, I guess, that would be closest to this would be the state that a person would feel if they were going to the symphony or if they were going to the opera. They'd be very relaxed, very comfortable environment. They'd also be paying a lot of attention. Normally our idea of attention and learning is one of stress, one of tension. preparing for the examination, being present in the class, paying attention, taking notes, and the rest. Well, this is one element that we want to exclude from the class. So our psychological environment is one that we call the concert state. We try to develop this concert state in the classroom. And the students respond to it quite interestingly. Our classes run for 3.5 hours. We don't always have $400 chairs to sit on, the relaxation chairs. But even on iron folding chairs, after 3.5 hours of class, they come out quite relaxed and really enjoying learning, which is really the psychological principle that we're trying to develop. Learning should be enjoyable. Why it is not taken as enjoyable, I think, is really a problem not only of the teacher, but also of the whole educational system that we are facing here.
One of my favorite things about Infinity is the opportunity that I have to ask dumb questions, and here comes a dumb one. One of the factors that affects a person's relaxed state at the symphony or at the opera or at any other artistic performance could be the amount that they paid for the ticket to get into the performance, and sometimes anxiety builds up as you're waiting for the performance and even during the performance, and you might wonder, was it really worth what I paid to get this orchestra seat? Does that come into play? Is there an economic factor, particularly if you're talking about teaching adults a foreign language in our culture, in America in 1983?
Well, there is an economic factor. John F. Kennedy University is geared to teaching the working adult. And any person who takes a class there not only has tuition payments, but he's also giving up a lot of his time that would be used with the family or time that would be used for relaxation and other endeavors. So there is an investment on the part of the students, and I think your example of the investment, the economic investment of going to the opera with their very high prices is much similar. The students do invest themselves in the course, and they do feel that this is worthwhile.
Is there an anxiety that can be created by that financial investment? God, I hope it works for me because I really need to learn this language, and I put all this money into it, and I put the time and the energy into coming into this thing, or is that forgotten by the other aesthetic steps that are taken?
Well, this is something we deal with the first day of class, and we deal with it throughout the whole class, the whole duration of the course. A student will come into one of our classes and will be subjected immediately to a complete change in his identity. We assign them new names so that if a person makes a mistake, it's not he who's making the mistake, but the new identity, the new profession that's making this mistake. A form of guilt transference, but also a form of allowing the people in the class to establish a whole new social order among themselves, one of suspended disbelief. And so we try to suspend out to these critical points. Also, the production on the part of the students is immediately noticed by them, and it's intended to be. Normally in a language class, you'd get a beginning dialogue of maybe 6 lines, and people would take it home and they memorize that. Mm-hmm. What's being told to them there is that this is what is expected of them, nothing more is expected of them. And so their whole belief system is geared to a 6-line dialogue to a very minimal performance level. Well, in our first dialogue, we end up with over 30 pages of script that they have. They've had over 800 new lexical items during those 30 pages. They've been subjected to about 5 different tenses. But more importantly, their whole self-impression of what is expected of them, the whole self-expectancy level, is radically changed. And very soon, they begin to believe in it. It's sort of like teaching students to walk on water. When they start doing it, it's a bit surprising, and even to the teacher.
You suggested early on that the technique and the methods that you're using are considerably more efficient and effective than the methods being used by the State Department to train people that are going into the Foreign Service. Obviously, the State Department is not ignorant of these methods. They must be aware of them, particularly if it was originally funded by the Russians in Bulgaria. It probably showed up in some CIA dossier somewhere.
Well, the State Department has not conducted any pilot program. We have been approached by people in the Defense Department, Monterey Institute of Language, Defense Language Institute. They are going to be conducting a pilot program using this method, teaching Russian, and their Russian program is 1,400 hours of class. The pilot program is designed to do the same thing in about 300 hours. This will be happening. even though it comes 20 years after the development of the original work.
Better late than never, huh? One quick final question before we get to a little experiment that we're going to do. What if the individual involved used classical music?
Yes, we use both classical and Baroque music in the classroom.
What if you don't like classical or Baroque music? What if that happens to be something that, for whatever reason in your background and environment, becomes a negative stimuli?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is one of the problems that the teacher has, is to constantly look at the barriers that the students have toward any portion of the teaching process. It may be, as you say, one of liking or disliking a certain element. It may also be a logical barrier that they don't believe it's possible that this work can be done. They're highly skeptical of it. And you may also have an ethical type of barrier. A lot of people look at this as a form of subtle brainwashing, where all of the stimuli, emotive, peripheral, and the rest are being controlled. Well, the teacher or the orchestrator at that point has to desuggest out those elements. And one of the ways of desuggesting out are to use the other two barriers in concert against the like or the dislike. Perhaps to tell the student, well, I can understand that you don't especially like classical music. However, logically, look at the effect that's going on. Look how much you're learning doing this. Or ethically, this is a very beautiful type of learning that's spreading all over different portions of the world. This is something that people are very interested in doing.
We have a little demonstration that we're going to do. Why don't you just launch right into that?
Okay. Normally, our teaching cycle would have us give an immense amount of material. The first class, it takes 2 hours just to read the material to the students. We'll be doing a very brief demonstration today.
Okay.
The first reading that you will be hearing is a reading that will be accompanied by classical music. And the idea of incorporating art into this presentation is to also engender an emotive response on the part of the student. The scene is on board an airplane. The stewardess is about to address the passengers. The language is Spanish. In the classroom, the students have already been informed of what the reading will be. They're also following a bilingual text. In our example here, the stewardess is telling the passengers, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Argentine Airlines flight number 50 for Lima, Guayaquil, and Mexico City." Buenos días, damas y caballeros. Bienvenidos a bordo Aerolíneas Argentinas, vuelo número 50, con destino a Lima, Guayaquil y a la Ciudad de México. Buenos días, damas y caballeros. Bienvenidos a bordo Aerolíneas Argentinas, vuelo número 50, con destino a Lima, Guayaquil y a la Ciudad de México.
And that's how it works in summation.
In summation, during the first concert, we had the variation of the art, a lot of artistic variation in the music, contrasted with a very methodical, analytical type of reading. Students at that point are requested, while looking at their book, to follow the intonation pattern, to repeat silently in their minds what they had heard. And during the second reading, we had just the contrary go on. We had a very methodical music with a more emotive type of reading pattern. So we're constantly trying to harmonize both the emotive, intuitive effect together with the logical, linear effect.
And we're going to land in Mexico City at 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
That's right.
Okay. Have you had students who have approached this instructional technique with an open mind and failed?
I think the question of an open mind is a very interesting question. I think we're all conditioned a lot by our idea of what education is. Many students have an idea of failure that to us really isn't failure. I was using this method teaching migrant farm workers in the San Joaquin Valley how to speak English a couple of years ago, and some of their children who are either dropouts or people who are expelled from the public schools, so that they could go through and get their GED. One little anecdote was about one of the girls, the migrant farm worker girl, who had been expelled from the school system. She was learning algebra with us. It was sort of a placebo. This was, to their belief, the hardest thing possible to learn. And so if we could show them how easy that was, then all other portions of the learning program would be easy. Well, after her going through about 2 or 3 weeks of the program, obtaining 90%, 95% on the examination and the rest, she came to me and she was very upset. She said, well, when are we going to get busy? When am I going to start learning? I'm giving all my time to this. I said, well, you already are. Look at your results. Look at your tests. Look how much you've done. She said, well, but this isn't learning. This is fun. You know. So to her mind, it was a failure to have succeeded because she was conditioned to the idea that learning had to be something that was not enjoyable, something that was work, something that was unpleasant.
Is there a practical application for American public schools? I'm one of those many parents in the audience right now that has a real difficult time with some of the techniques, some of the textbooks, some of the approaches to learning that are so prevalent in the public school systems in this country right now and around the Bay Area.
Well, I think it has a very big implication. How much is going to be done about it by our public school system is really another question. What is being proposed is a very revolutionary concept. In Eastern countries, it's part of their belief that you develop the individual's capacity to the highest extent possible. And this because the individual is a member of the state and is an asset of the state. I'm not saying that this is particularly favorable or not, but this is the idea. I think in our educational system we have more of the idea that we develop the capacity of the individual to the most marketable extent possible. And you have conflict at that point. You have accelerating groups going, you have special interest groups affecting other teaching. I think really to implement a type of teaching like this where you accelerate learning, where learning becomes a pleasure, you have to really look at not only a technique or a textbook or a teacher or a curriculum. I think you have to really reevaluate the whole approach to learning that goes on in the country.
Is it necessary to have a small classroom situation, a limited number of students in order for this technique to be effective?
Most of the testing that went on in the Eastern countries and also in the United States and Canada is done with groups that are small, groups of 12. However, we've doubled that number at John F. Kennedy during the summer. We've had 24 and more students in the class. You get a different result. You have a different dynamic working. It's not necessarily a better result or a worse result. It's just a different result. And we were able to achieve the same degree of acceleration with those larger groups.
Does the group proceed at the speed of the fastest member or the slowest member?
Well, everyone's traveling at sort of light year velocity anyway, so it's very hard to judge if you are a student how fast one is going and the other. We always ask the students to measure their progress in terms of where they are coming from rather in terms of how another student is progressing. We don't want to lose anyone, but we do want to maintain a state of sort of controlled overwhelm at all times so that the students react within that belief system.
You talked a little bit about results, and you gave that wonderful anecdote of the young lady who was learning algebra. Are there other have some statistically oriented results been put together?
Yes, UNESCO published a whole report on this back in 1979, verifying the acceleration rate that was obtained in Bulgaria at that time. Canada also, in 1976, was very active using this, and documentation on the results have been around for quite a bit.
Are these techniques currently in use in Bulgaria, some of the Eastern European countries, and if so, how successful have they been with them?
It is being used not only in Bulgaria, but also in East Germany and in the Soviet Union. During the last Olympics, the Soviet Union trained a lot of their people to speak the languages of the participants using this method. East Germany is also doing a lot of work. Hungary is also doing a lot of pioneer work using this method. Presently, in the Soviet Union, Maurice Thorez Institute, which is the largest teacher training institute in foreign languages in the world, has adopted this method to train its teachers, its language teachers.
Are they concerned that you have adapted these methods here in the West?
They're really trying to promote the spread of this teaching method, not only in the West, but also in other areas. We do have a problem that since Afghanistan, Bulgaria and the Soviet Union have not been dealing with the United States directly, but they have been dealing with Canada and Japan and some of the other countries in developing this technique.
So in a sense, we're getting the technique in the back door as opposed to in the front door.
In the back door up until very recently, when our university, John F. Kennedy, was granted authorization by the Bulgarians to use this. So this is really the first time that an American university has been granted this demonstration status.
What's the pie-in-the-sky future for this learning technique?
Well, it is sort of a revolutionary type of teaching method. You mentioned that in the introduction. Hopefully the revolution will spread to other areas of education.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.